Hi, I'm Alan Hedblum. Welcome to our show, a place to feel like you belong. Our guest today, Christine Lee, is a writer living in Berkeley, California. She came into the national spotlight when she wrote a poignant article for BuzzFeed about her experience of having a stroke at age 33. She caught the attention of Feel Like You Belong with her blog piece, How to Watch Fresh Off the Boat with Your White Boyfriend. It's my pleasure to welcome via Skype, Christine Lee. Hey, Christine.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Alan.
You bet. So, born in New York City in 1973 to Korean immigrant parents was actually not an easy time for your family. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I don't think immigration's ever easy. And I think each family's experience is very unique. In my case, I think it was compounded by the fact that in 1973, America was still relatively new to immigration after immigration was blocked for about 40 years until 1965. So there are a little bit of, social disconnects, to feel like a foreigner in a country that wasn't used to foreigners for quite some time. So there's that.
And your family was having a struggle because your parents were working professionals back in Korea, coming here, and it was a different situation in terms of language and employability.
Sure. My mom was a nurse, and she was recruited as a nurse and came to the United States. And she was able to continue as a nurse. But of course, communication's always an issue in terms of promotions and such. And my dad was an engineer, and he was recruited here as an engineer. And that didn't work out for him because of the challenges that he faced outside of his knowledge set as an engineer. You just, it's really hard to adjust and deal with a new language and the culture and the politics of being inside a corporation. And, and coming from a country in which they were pretty much top tier, given their educational background, and then coming to a new country where they weren't treated in the same way. It was a really rough adjustment.
There's a sense of maybe a loss of dignity, a loss of sense of self, I think, for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Definitely for my father, who just couldn't, it was just a very, very rough transition for him. And to that end, that's why he became a small business owner, so that he could immunize himself, or at least, give himself a little sanctuary from all of that and create his own little world.
Sure. Self-empowerment to create what's around you. Absolutely.
And I think that's why a lot of immigrants do small businesses and they're entrepreneurs, because almost out of necessity.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you were growing up, you said that your mom just couldn't make bologna sandwiches.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about food and school lunches.
Yeah, I grew up with Korean food, so much so that I decided that when I grew up, I was just going to be able to cook all different kinds of cuisines. My mother couldn't cook spaghetti. I asked her for spaghetti, and she went into some of my Italian friends and said, "How do you make spaghetti? What do you do?" And they said, "Well, here's my special secret ingredient, celery." And so my mom chopped up some celery very finely, and then put it in with a can of tomatoes. I don't even think it was a can of tomatoes. I think it was just fresh tomatoes. And I think she simmered it all of 5 minutes and then served it to me on some pasta. Of course, that doesn't taste like spaghetti sauce, so that was a complete fail. My mom's actually a really good cook, not just within Korean cuisine. And then just for school lunches, it was rough, I ended up just buying school lunches because my mom would pack me lunches, and it would be Wonder Bread, a slice of bologna, a slice of American cheese, and some Miracle Whip, and she slapped that together and give me an apple and a piece of string cheese. Nothing that you could trade at lunch, nothing that anybody else wanted. And so I just happily bought school lunches after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I had mentioned in the introduction, you caught our attention because of this wonderful article that you wrote about Fresh Off the Boat. And in our discussion, you called that show seminal. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, for obvious reasons, it's the first successful Asian American sitcom out there. And I think we could call it successful at this point, given its ratings and such in that time slot. I think also it's the second chance that we had after All American Girl failed in the 90s.
Margaret Cho.
Yeah, that was the show starring Margaret Cho, about Margaret Cho's life. As much as Fresh Off the Boat is about Chef Eddie Huang's life. And that other show just didn't, it just wasn't funny. And I think that it caused Margaret also made incredible sacrifices to do that show. And some of the sacrifices she made, she deeply regrets, because that show got so watered down and didn't resemble her life, let alone Asian American life and issues. And I think that because of that, Fresh Off the Boat is groundbreaking because it's funny and people are watching it, and people who aren't Asian are watching it. And it may not be a perfect show, but it gets the eyeballs out. There are eyeballs watching. There are people watching and connecting and finding something to relate to.
Yeah. So talk about the experience of watching the show with Orion. How did that happen actually?
Yeah, so I mean, I was just sitting there watching the show on my DVR because I was watching it in secret. Because, understandably, I thought maybe it would be really bad, and I just kind of, if it wasn't funny, didn't ever want it to be, I didn't want it to be an issue. And so I was watching it by myself, and my boyfriend came down and was like, "What are you watching?" Because he could hear me laughing in the room. And I said, "Well, it's a show that it's a show about Asian Americans that I was afraid wouldn't be funny, but it is funny. So you want to watch it with me?" And he sat down and he watched it with me, and
started it from the beginning.
I rewound it for him from the beginning because I had only watched about 5-10 minutes. And it was really interesting. I got to see what was funny to both of us, what was funny to me, and what was funny to him, and what he didn't understand. And in that sense, it was like, gave me a microcosm for the American viewing experience.
Sure. And for him, or for both of you, then a chance for discussion about, cultural things that were sort of under his radar before.
Yes. I mean, he's a third generation Italian American, so he's not, immigration is something that is a part of his family culture. His grandmother immigrated to the U.S. and she lived for quite some time. So it's not foreign to him that, that immigration exists in family histories. But, my family immigrated in the 1960s. His family immigrated in the 1950s. So there's that time difference. And also there were different issues throughout. Skin color is always an issue, whether you can pass or not. And so that was really interesting. And also the sociocultural climate. The fact that Asian Americans on Fresh Off the Boat thought that living in the suburbs was the wild, wild west. That was something I had to explain to them. Like, well, that is the Wild West. When you're the only one.
That's scary.
It's all context as to what feels safe. And, that wasn't the case for him because America didn't really have suburbs in the they were just forming in the 50s after the war. So there were a lot of interesting, points to discuss and learn. I mean, it wasn't a huge, long discussion, but it was just it was insightful to both of us.
But it gives him permission to ask a little bit about, aspects of your life, your lived experience that he might not otherwise have recognized or thought to ask.
Maybe, yeah. Certainly it would never have come up that the suburbs were the wild, wild west. I'm somebody that does bring up race a lot. and is because it's a part of my life. So it's a topic that comes up often between him and me, not in this heated way, but just happens to come up. Just like people who like food like to bring food up, or when you read people who like a certain writer like to talk about that book. And for me, race is an ongoing issue in my life, and so I happen to bring it up. So these aren't issues that we've never discussed before, but certainly little facts and safe little funny things off which to springboard were certainly there.
It gives a permission, and I think it kind of depressurizes an otherwise very sensitive topic in the United States.
Yes.
Especially white people don't like to talk about race.
And it keeps it from being not personal. Yeah. And I think that what happens is people take things very personally. Yeah. And it's like, no, it's not really an attack on you. Maybe, maybe not. But you can't leap to the conclusion that it's a personal attack first.
Yeah. And comedy gives you permission to enter there as a safe space.
Yeah. I mean, I think the best comedy is comedy that can tell the truth, but in a way that provides people, another angle that's humorous.
Yep.
Richard Pryor, Margaret Cho, they're just amazing comedians that bring up social issues. David Chappelle as well, bring up social issues. Chris Rock too, bring up social issues and really drive points home, but in a way that people can stomach.
Mm-hmm. So what does Fresh Off the Boat get right? What does it do really well? Especially because you're a writer, you understand storytelling. So what does it do right?
I think it does well the fact that it's not very self-conscious. I think that once as a writer, you constantly think of your audience. And of course, this is television, so they actually are thinking about their audience. And so there's a limitation to that. But they are the stories are about that unique family. Now, Chef Eddie Huang has gone on record saying that the show no longer represents his family. But even so, even if this family has taken on a fictitious nature, these are unique issues, and they talk about their specific situations. And I really think that there is universality in the particular.
Absolutely.
So, I don't know, let me think of an episode in which that occurs. Moving to the suburbs, that particular restaurant, and the fact that they're trying to make, it's not just a restaurant. It's not a Chinese restaurant that everybody, expects a Chinese immigrant family to have. It's a steak restaurant. It's not just a steak restaurant. It's a knockoff of an existing steak restaurant in the area. So everything's very specific. And those parts, when the show gets very specific, it gets things right.
Mm-hmm. Sure. We have to wrap up in a minute here, but I'd like to ask you about your current book project. What are you working on now?
So I have a 2-book deal. The first book that's going to be, my first book is a memoir about my stroke based on that BuzzFeed essay. And it is called Whole, W-H-O-L-E, purposefully a homonym. And it's about my stroke and my recovery therefrom. It'll be out from Echo Books next year. And then I also have my novel in progress, which is about a Korean immigrant in New York in 1972 who makes a golem to find a long-lost family member. And that's also going to be out from Echo, but I think that's due out in 2017.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we'll be glad to put a link to your writer's website on the Feel Like You Belong website so people can get in touch with you. And I want to thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you very much, Alan.
And for folks watching back home, stay tuned. We'll be back shortly with some tips on American culture, American language, and a little bit of humor. What is the difference between the following statements? Number one, Latinos are closed to outsiders. They only do business among themselves. And number two, trust is important in the Latino community. To do business, you first need to build relationships. In intercultural conversations, we make a big distinction between stereotypes and generalizations. If you remember only one idea from this conversation, remember this: generalizations are helpful. Stereotypes are hurtful. These two concepts are often confused because they both involve making broad statements about a group of people. This is where the similarity ends. When we make a generalization, we are attempting to look at the behavior of many people and note similarities. While we do this, we focus on being descriptive and not judgmental. We're also able to modify this broad view if we encounter new examples which disprove the description that we're trying to make. On the other hand, stereotypes tend to lock people into categories with the idea of limiting that group. Stereotypes seek to make judgments rather than to describe. Once we make stereotypes, we are then often reluctant to modify them. In the examples we mentioned earlier, statement number 1 uses judgmental words like closed and only. By contrast, statement number 2 gives examples to describe and not judge interpersonal behavior. We can use the second statement to inform how we might approach Latinos for the purpose of doing business. The first statement gives us a negative view which doesn't allow any flexibility or growth. This negative view will then be retained in our subconscious, where we don't think about it, and can influence our future interactions. On the other hand, the generalization of statement number 2 gives us actionable knowledge which may or may not be borne out in individual interactions with, say, Mexicans or Venezuelans. We don't take the generalization as ironclad, but it gives us principles to consider when we enter into relationships with members of that group. Here's a useful summary to keep in mind. Generalizations are helpful because they are used consciously and analytically. They're descriptive and flexible. They seek to be accurate. They're an attempt to capture similarities and principles. And they are constantly modified by new input. Stereotypes are harmful because they're used unconsciously and reactively. They're judgmental and rigid. They seek to be simple, and they're an attempt to limit and pigeonhole. And finally, they're fixed and not open to revisiting. I hope this distinction is useful to you. Let us know if you have good examples of generalizations that have helped you in intercultural situations.